The sun was setting over the village, casting long shadows between the ancient trees that stood like silent guardians around the small, remote settlement. Deep in the heart of the forest, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and vibrant flowers, the village thrived. Its people lived close to the land, listening to the whisper of the wind, the murmur of the river, and the rhythm of the drums that marked the passing of seasons. Here, the ancestors' spirits did not simply linger in memory. They walked among the living, guiding them with the wisdom passed down through generations. At the start of each season, the people gathered to perform sacred rituals. The elders, revered for their deep knowledge and spiritual power, led the ceremonies, speaking words that connected the village to the ancient world. Their wisdom shaped every decision, every action. The sound of drums reverberated through the air, marking the heartbeat of the land itself. But not all hearts beat in harmony with the rhythm of the old ways. Kofi, a young man with fire in his eyes and ambition in his soul, felt it most keenly. He was known for his extraordinary drumming skills, a gift inherited from his forefathers. Yet, despite his talent, there was a restlessness in Kofi that could not be quieted by the steady beat of the drums. Kofi's father, Elder Kwame, was the village's most respected leader, a man whose knowledge of the land and its spirits was unmatched. He had long been a guide to his people, the keeper of traditions and the protector of ancient customs. But to Kofi, his father's wisdom, while respected, felt like chains that bound him to the past. "I see beyond the trees, Father," Kofi would say, frustration creeping into his voice. "The world is changing. The village must change with it, or we will be left behind." Elder Kwame's face would harden, his deep-set eyes reflecting the weight of 1,000 years of wisdom. "Change is not always progress, my son. The spirits walk with us because we honor the past. Without the past, we would be lost." But Kofi could not quiet the fire inside him. The world was moving forward, and the village, with all its traditions and rituals, seemed like a place stuck in time. He saw the suffering of the people, their struggles with crop failure, the burden of age-old customs, the fear of unknown diseases. He believed that modernization could bring solutions, and it was in the beat of the drums where he saw his greatest hope. But the sacred drums, the village's most sacred artifact, remained untouched, kept under the watchful eyes of the elders. These drums were not just instruments. They were the vessel through which the village communicated with the ancestors, a connection to the spiritual realm. The story of the drums was passed down from generation to generation, a tale of power and danger. Long ago, a warrior king, overcome by pride, had played the drums recklessly, unleashing a curse that ravaged the land and claimed many lives. The drums are not toys, the elders would say. They are gifts from the gods, and to play them without divine permission is to call down misfortune upon yourself. But Kofi dismissed these stories. They were mere superstition in his eyes, relics of a time when people feared the unknown. He was determined to prove that the drums could do more than summon spirits. They could bring prosperity, growth, and change. In the dead of night, when the village was silent and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl, Kofi slipped away. His footsteps were soft as he made his way to the sacred grove, the trees seeming to part before him as if they knew his purpose. The drums, hidden within the grove and guarded by the elders, stood in their sacred circle. Their ancient wood was dark and polished, the carvings on their surface telling stories older than the village itself. Kofi stood before them, heart pounding. He had come so close to them before, always held back by the warnings of his elders. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he would touch the drums. Tonight, he would prove that he was capable of something greater than the boundaries of tradition. He believed in himself. He believed in his vision, and the drums. They were the key to the future. "Father does not understand," Kofi whispered, to the wind, his voice filled with determination. I will make them understand. I will show them that the world is changing, and the village must change with it." His hands trembled as he reached for the drum. The moment his fingers brushed the ancient wood, a chill ran down his spine. The air around him thickened, as if the spirits themselves were watching. But Kofi was undeterred. He struck the drum with force, the sound echoing through the grove. It was not the rhythmic, steady beat of the village drums. It was wild, urgent, a sound that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the night. For a moment, all was still. The night birds ceased their songs. The wind stopped. Kofi held his breath, his heart racing. He had done it. He had unlocked the power of the drums. But in the silence that followed, Kofi felt something stir in the air. A presence, cold and unfamiliar. The drums, once a symbol of unity, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The ground beneath him trembled. "No. This cannot be," Kofi murmured to himself, his face pale. "I was careful. I did not anger the spirits." Yet deep in his heart, Kofi knew he had crossed a line. The drums were not just instruments of music. They were a connection to something far greater, and now he had disturbed it. In that moment, Kofi realized the weight of what he had done. He had defied tradition, ignored the warnings, and disturbed the balance between the living and the dead. But it was too late to turn back now. The drums had spoken, and their call would not be ignored. The village hummed with the rhythm of its ancient ways, the steady beat of life flowing through the hearts of its people. It was a place where the past and present coexisted, where the whispers of ancestors mingled with the rustling of leaves. But in the heart of it, Kofi felt a growing unease. As the moon rose high one evening, Kofi found himself standing in the village square, facing his father, Elder Kwame, and the gathering of elders. The firelight flickered in their eyes, casting shadows on the faces of the respected figures who had carried the wisdom of their ancestors for generations. "Father," Kofi's voice was filled with tension. "This village, this life, it's stagnant. We must evolve or we will wither away like the crops in a barren field." Elder Kwame's face hardened, the deep creases on his forehead deepening as his eyes, filled with years of wisdom, looked at his son with quiet sorrow. "The land has given us life, Kofi. The ancestors guide us. It is their wisdom that protects us from harm. Do you think we can simply discard all that has come before us?" Kofi's hands clenched at his sides, his anger rising. "I do not discard it, Father. I honor it. But I believe there is more to life than what we have known. You speak of the ancestors, but they do not walk among us as they once did. The world is changing, Father. We must change with it." The elders exchanged glances, murmurs of concern rippling through the circle. They had long watched Kofi's growing restlessness. Elder Kwame's voice was low, but firm. "It is the ancestors' teachings that have kept us safe. The drums, the rituals, these are the sacred bonds between us and them. If we defy them, we will invite ruin upon us all." Kofi shook his head. "The drums, the very drums that have kept us bound to the past? They are nothing but relics of an ancient time. I will play them, Father. I will show you that change does not have to be feared." Elder Kwame's eyes darkened, his voice thick with pain. "Do not be a fool, my son. The drums are not just instruments. They are the voices of the ancestors. To touch them without their blessing is to call down a curse. You are a son of this land. Do not forget who you are." But Kofi, his heart burning with a desire for something greater, refused to listen. He turned away from his father and the elders, his mind set on the path he had chosen. Later that night, when the village was quiet and the stars cast their pale light over the land, Kofi stood at the edge of the sacred grove. The moon hung low, bathing the grove in a soft, silvery glow. The sacred drums, carefully hidden away for generations, sat in their sacred hut, untouched and untapped, their carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. Kofi's breath caught in his chest. The drums, he could feel their power, their calling. It was as if they had been waiting for him. He hesitated for only a moment. He had heard the stories of kings who had unleashed destruction upon the land by playing these drums. But those were just stories, weren't they? Old tales, meant to keep the people in line, to hold them back. Without another thought, Kofi stepped into the sacred hut. The air inside felt charged, thick with ancient power. The drums sat there, silent but alive with the energy of the earth itself. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the surface. The moment he touched them, the sound of the world seemed to stop. The air held its breath. Then, with a sharp, quick motion, Kofi struck the drum. The earth beneath him trembled as the deep, resonating beat filled the air. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, a rhythm that surged through his very veins, calling him to action. The trees outside seemed to sway in time with the drums, their branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the sound. The animals in the forest stirred uneasily, but Kofi was lost in the power, in the feeling that this was his moment. He played again, his heart pounding, his hands moving faster. The drums seemed to come alive under his touch, responding to his every motion, sending shockwaves through the ground, through the trees. Kofi's chest swelled with pride. This was it. This was the power he had longed for. He could feel the weight of history in the beat, the pulse of the land itself. He was no longer just a young man of the village. He was a part of something greater. He had unlocked the true power of the drums. But as the sound of the drums continued to echo through the forest, a faint whisper seemed to rise from within the rhythm itself. It was soft at first, barely a murmur, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Stop," the whisper said, a voice ancient and mournful. "You do not understand." But Kofi, driven by his ambition and pride, ignored the warning. He played louder, faster, the rhythm wild and uncontrolled. The drums were his, and he would not stop now. In that moment, the earth groaned beneath him. The trees shook, and the wind began to howl. Kofi's heart pounded in his chest as he played with increasing fervor. But the village, peaceful and untouched by the world's chaos, began to stir. Strange things were happening. The animals of the forest, once calm and predictable, began to act erratically. The birds screeched in distress, and the wild creatures, who usually roamed the forest with ease, ran in frenzied patterns as if chasing something unseen. The crops, once lush and vibrant, began to wither. The soil seemed dry, drained of life, as though the earth itself had turned against the village. At dawn, a dark cloud appeared over the village, casting an unnatural shadow that seemed to swallow the light. The elders, sensing the disturbance, gathered in the village square. Their faces were grave, their spirits uneasy. Elder Kwame, his heart heavy with the weight of his son's disobedience, walked slowly to the sacred grove. As he neared the hut, his eyes widened in horror. There stood Kofi, still drumming, the rhythms wild and unrestrained. The pulse of the drums seemed to shake the very air, and Elder Kwame's heart sank. He could feel it. The curse had been triggered. "Kofi!" Elder Kwame shouted, his voice shaking with a mix of grief and anger. "Do you not see what you have done? You have brought the wrath of the ancestors upon us." But Kofi, lost in his pride, did not hear. He continued to drum, oblivious to the destruction he had unleashed. The trees outside swayed wildly, Idihi. Ground beneath him, trembling. The village was changing. It was as if the earth itself was in turmoil, reacting to Kofi's defiance. The drums had spoken, but Kofi had ignored their warnings. The curse was real, and its effects were already being felt. The village, once peaceful and thriving, would never be the same, and neither would Kofi. The moon had long since disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds, and the once peaceful village now felt the weight of its own unrest. Kofi, with his heart pounding in his chest, stood alone in the sacred hut, the drums before him glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air around him seemed thick with an invisible energy, and though the night was still, Kofi's pulse raced as if the earth itself had begun to vibrate with anticipation. The ancestors had warned him. No, they had begged him to leave the drums untouched. Yet, Kofi had ignored their cries, dismissing their wisdom as outdated, trapped in a time long past. He believed the power of the drums would make him greater than any who had come before. Power to change his village, to silence the voices of tradition that had bound him in place for so long. But now, as his fingers brushed against the drum skin once more, a heavy presence seemed to loom in the air. Kofi took a deep breath, his fingers trembling, and then, with a force that seemed to echo in the very soil beneath his feet, he struck the drum. Boom! The sound reverberated through the forest like a mighty storm, awakening the very spirit of the land. At first, Kofi was filled with an exhilarating sense of power, but as the vibrations spread, something darker began to stir. The once silent trees groaned and swayed as if they, too, felt the earth shaking beneath their roots. The winds, which had been calm moments before, began to stir, swirling into a faint whisper. It was as if the village, the land, and even the ancestors themselves were watching him. Kofi struck the drum again. Boom, boom. The ground beneath him trembled. The air thickened. He felt invincible. The village would finally bow before him. He would show them all that change could come, that his strength would bring prosperity, not destruction. But with every beat, the sky darkened, the winds howled, and an uncomfortable, gnawing feeling crept into Kofi's heart. From deep within the forest, there came an eerie silence. The birds, once lively and chatty, were gone. Even the wild animals, who had roamed freely under the moonlit canopy, had abandoned the village. The earth, which had once given bountiful harvests, seemed to pull back. The crops wilted as if they were starving for water. The river, which had once flowed like blood through the land, had dried up. The villagers, those who still dared to leave their homes, looked at the parched earth with fear in their eyes. No one knew where the animals had gone, but they could feel that something had gone horribly wrong. The drums kept calling. Boom, boom, boom. The rhythm was now wild, frenzied. Kofi's hands moved faster, consumed by a hunger for more power, more glory. But with each beat, a shadow seemed to grow around him. The wind whipped the trees into a frenzy, and the drum's voice became a roar in his ears. Then, without warning, the sky split with a mighty crack. Lightning rained down, striking the land like the hand of the heavens, each bolt coming closer, faster, as if to punish him. And then came the visions. Kofi's breath caught in his throat as shadows began to form before him. Figures, ancient and wise yet filled with anger, appeared from the edges of his vision, the spirits of his ancestors. The first to step forward was his father, Elder Kwame. His once proud face was twisted in sorrow, his eyes burning with disappointment. Kofi. The voice came, not through his ears, but through his mind. You have awakened the wrath of the ancestors. You have broken the sacred bond with the earth, with the spirits. What have you done? Kofi stumbled backward, his heart racing. He could feel the heat of his father's gaze, even though the elder was not physically present. The storm raged louder now, as if the heavens themselves were punishing him. Kofi, the land calls for your judgment, another voice echoed, the voice of his mother, soft and filled with sorrow. You have forgotten us. You have betrayed the wisdom of our people. The drums are not for you to wield as a toy, as a weapon. Boom! The drum's call was no longer a song of triumph. They were the beating heart of the earth itself, a thundering drum of punishment. The sound was deafening now, Every beat pulled at Kofi's chest as though the land was trying to pull him under. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices of the ancestors filled his mind. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the winds. His mind spun, and in that moment of terror he understood. The curse had been awakened, and there would be no escape from the reckoning he had invited. "Stop! Please, stop!" Kofi cried out, but the drums would not cease. Just then, Elder Kwame arrived, his steps heavy with the weight of 1,000 generations. The villagers had gathered behind him, their faces etched with fear and fury. They saw their village dying, their crops withering, their river drying, and they knew it was Kofi's actions that had brought this doom. "Kofi!" Elder Kwame's voice was like thunder in the storm. "You have defied the ways of the ancestors. The drums are not a tool for power, but a reminder of what we must respect. You have brought destruction upon us all." The villagers stood behind the elder, their eyes burning with the same fury that had filled their hearts when they first saw the crops die, when they first heard the thunder crack. They had once revered Kofi, believing him to be a leader of great potential, but now he was the one who had torn their world apart. Kofi stood, trembling. His pride, once a fire in his belly, now lay smoldering in the ashes of his dreams. "I only wanted to change things. I wanted to bring us something better." The elder shook his head, sorrow and anger mingling in his eyes. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. "You have brought us the wrath of the ancestors, Kofi. You have forgotten that true power is not in defiance but in respect." The storm raged on, its fury now palpable. The ground shook beneath their feet as the drums, now out of Kofi's control, seemed to beat faster and faster, as if urging the world itself to collapse. Suddenly, a great clap of thunder split the sky, and the ground beneath them trembled so violently that the huts around them cracked and crumbled to the earth. The once proud village was no more. Kofi's heart sank as he realized the full extent of his mistake. The power he sought, the glory he craved, had come at the cost of everything he loved. There was no escape from this curse, no way to undo what he had done. The earth seemed to reject him. The sky, which had once seemed endless, now felt like a suffocating weight. He had invited destruction into his village, and there was no turning back. The ancestors had spoken, and now they would have their justice. The storm raged on, but Kofi knew, deep down, that the reckoning had only just begun. The air was heavy with the scent of decay as Kofi's hands gripped the sacred drums, his heartbeat in sync with their thunderous sound. Each beat sent ripples through the village, growing stronger, sharper, until it felt as though the very earth beneath him trembled in protest. The land, once vibrant with life, now seemed cursed. The crops that had once flourished in the fertile soil now withered, their leaves curling up like the hands of the dead. The once flowing river, the village's lifeblood, had dried up. The rocks where children had once played and drawn water now stood exposed, barren, like bones in a desert. Kofi, oblivious to the devastation around him, continued to play, his eyes wild with ambition. He believed that with each drumbeat, he could summon a change, one that would grant him the power he sought. But with each resounding thrum, the curse only deepened, turning the land against him. The animals of the forest, who had once danced freely through the village, now fled in. Terror. The lions, the antelopes, and the birds, each seemed to vanish as if driven away by an unseen force. Their absence left the village eerily silent, a silence that was punctuated only by the echo of the drums. In the distance, Elder Kwame stood with the other villagers, his heart heavy with sorrow. The elders spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with fear. They knew the curse was growing stronger. They knew Kofi's actions were angering the ancestors, but Kofi, in his arrogance, would not listen. "Do you see it? Do you hear the drums?" Elder Kwame asked the villagers, his voice low and trembling. "The ancestors are angry. The land is dying because of the boy's pride. If he does not stop, we will all suffer." But Kofi, consumed by his desire for power, could not hear the warnings. His mind was fixed on the drums, each beat pushing him further into madness. He believed that through them he could reshape the village's fate, that he could control the forces that had once ruled them all. As the curse deepened, Kofi's nights became plagued with visions. They came to him in the dark, shadows of his ancestors, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. Their eyes burned with an unspoken fury, and their voices echoed in his mind like a thunderstorm. "Kofi," one of them whispered, her voice like the wind rustling through the trees. "Why do you ignore us? Why do you call upon forces you do? Not understand?" Another voice, deeper and colder, rang out. "You have broken the sacred bond, Kofi. You have defied the spirits. You will pay for this betrayal." The sky above Kofi darkened, the winds howling with unnatural force. The storms that had once been a blessing to the land were now a curse, raging with fury. Thunder struck the earth with such power that the ground beneath him shook. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, lighting the world in blinding flashes. The very drums he had once played with pride now sounded like a warning, each beat like a thunderclap in his chest. Kofi tried to ignore the visions, tried to convince himself that they were only dreams, but with every passing moment, he could feel the weight of his betrayal pressing down on him. The drums, once a source of strength, now seemed to call for reckoning. He had unleashed something far beyond his control. The ground beneath his feet trembled, as if the ancestors themselves were preparing to reclaim the land. Kofi could no longer escape the truth. The curse had grown too powerful, too destructive. He had awakened something ancient, something that could not be controlled by arrogance or desire. But even in the face of this growing disaster, Kofi remained determined. He would not stop. He could not. Not until he had the power he sought. Not until he could change the course of his fate. He could hear the villagers' cries in the distance, but they were drowned out by the relentless sound of the drums. It was then that Elder Kwame, with the weight of the village's fate on his shoulders, led a group of villagers to confront Kofi. They found him in the sacred hut, where the drums echoed like a heartbeat in the silence of the night. "Kofi," Elder Kwame's voice cracked, with both sorrow and fury. "Stop. The land is dying, the river is dry, and the animals are gone. You must stop this madness." Kofi, his eyes wild with pride, looked at the elder. "I will not stop, not until I have what I seek. Only the drums can bring the change we need." The villagers, once loyal to Kofi, now looked upon him with fear. They could see the madness in his eyes, the same madness that had brought destruction to their land. They had trusted him, but now they saw only a man lost in his ambition, willing to sacrifice everything, including the land and people he had sworn to protect. Elder Kwame's face twisted with grief. "You do not understand, Kofi. The spirits are angry. The ancestors are calling for retribution. You have broken the bond that held this village together." Kofi stood tall, but the wind howled louder, as if to drown out the elder's words. The ground shook again, and the storm intensified. The curse had grown beyond anyone's control. "No," Kofi shouted, his voice drowned out by the fury of the storm. "I will not be swayed. I will control this fate." And with that, the storm unleashed its full wrath. The wind howled, the sky split with lightning, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. The sacred hut where the drums were kept was struck by lightning, setting it ablaze. The fire roared in the wind, a symbol of the destruction that had been set in motion. As the storm raged on, Kofi tried to flee, but the spirits seemed to chase him. The ground cracked beneath him, as if the land itself sought to swallow him whole. The drums continued to beat in the distance, their sound like the heartbeat of the earth itself, calling for retribution. The villagers scattered, seeking refuge from the storm's fury. But Kofi, unable to escape the curse he had unleashed, found himself trapped in the very force he had sought to control. The ancestors had come for him. In the midst of the chaos, Kofi's heart sank as the weight of his actions crashed down upon him. The storm, the earthquake, the very land itself, all of it was a consequence of his pride. He had sought power, but in doing so he had destroyed everything he loved. The drums, once a symbol of his ambition, had become his tormentor. As the storm reached its peak, Kofi fell to his knees, tears mingling with the rain that poured down from the heavens. He could hear the voices of the ancestors now, louder than ever, calling for justice. "Kofi," one voice whispered, "you sought power, but now you have paid the price. There is no escape from the fate you have chosen." The beating of the drums grew louder, more urgent, as if the earth itself was calling for retribution. Kofi's attempt to flee was futile. The spirits closed in around him, their wrath an inescapable force. And in the final moments, as the storm consumed the village, Kofi understood the true power of the drums. He had awakened something far greater than himself, something that could not be controlled. And as the curse finally claimed him, the village was left in ruins, its fate sealed by the hubris of one man who had defied the ancestors and the land itself. No escape, no mercy. Kofi stood alone in the shadow of the sacred hut, his heart heavy with the weight of his actions. The once vibrant village that had been his pride now lay in ruins, the land barren, and the skies darkened by the wrath he had unleashed. His hands trembled as he reached for the sacred drums, the same drums that had once filled him with power and ambition. Now they felt like an instrument of his downfall. He fell to his knees before them, the weight of regret pressing down on him like the earth itself. "Ancestors, hear my voice," Kofi cried, his voice breaking with emotion. "I have sinned. I have brought destruction upon this land. Please, forgive me. I beg for mercy." The air around him seemed to grow thick, charged with a tension that made his chest tighten. Slowly, from the shadows, the spirits of the ancestors began to materialize. Their faces were twisted in sorrow and anger, their eyes glowing with an intensity that pierced through Kofi's soul. The wind began to howl, carrying the voices of the spirits with it, their words echoing from the depths of the earth itself. "Foolish child," the spirits whispered, their voices a chorus of ancient wisdom. "You have defied us, broken the balance, and shattered the harmony between the living and the dead. You seek forgiveness, but do you understand the cost of your pride?" Kofi trembled, his body racked with guilt. "I was blind," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought I could control the future, that I could shape it with my own hands. But now, I see. I see the destruction I have caused." The spirits spoke again, their voices like the rumble of thunder in the distance. "Your life is not enough to undo the damage you have done. It is not just your blood we seek, but your heart. True repentance cannot be bought with a life. You must come to terms with the wisdom of the elders and return to the ways of the past. Only then can the curse be lifted." Kofi's eyes filled with tears as he realized the depth of his mistake. His arrogance had blinded him to the wisdom that had been passed down through generations. Now, only humility could save him, but would it be enough? With a heavy heart, Kofi rose to his feet. His hands, once so eager to command the drums, now reached for them in submission. He did not seek power anymore, only redemption. He knelt before the drums, his fingers trembling as he touched the surface. He began to play, but this time there was no defiance in the beat. The rhythm was slow, steady, and full of sorrow. Each strike of the drum echoed the weight of his apology, his remorse pouring into the sound. The drums, once a symbol of his pride, now seemed to respond with quiet acceptance, their beat gentler, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The air around him grew still, The storm clouds that had once raged above the village began to dissipate, their fury fading like the retreating tide. The land beneath Kofi seemed to sigh in relief, as though it had forgiven him. As Kofi continued to play, a subtle change began to take place. The crops that had withered began to show signs of life, their green shoots breaking through the cracked earth. The river, which had once been a dry bed, began to trickle with water once more, as if the land itself had forgiven him. The animals, once driven away by the curse, began to return, cautiously at first, but gradually the forest came alive again. Kofi's heart was still heavy, but now there was a sense of peace that he had never known. The spirits, having accepted his repentance, stood watch over the village, their anger lifted. The balance between the living and the dead was restored, and the curse had been lifted. Years passed, and Kofi, now older and wiser, became a respected elder in the village. He no longer sought power for himself, but instead shared his story with the younger generation, warning them of the dangers of arrogance and pride. He spoke of the importance of humility and respect for the wisdom of the elders, and the need to honor the traditions of the past. "Listen well, my children," he would say, his voice grave but kind. "The drum's beat calls to the soul, but only a humble heart can understand its rhythm. Seek not power, but wisdom. Respect the ancestors, for they hold the keys to the future. Do not forget the balance between the past and the future, for without the old ways, there can be no true progress." And so, the village flourished once more, its people carrying the lessons of Kofi's fall and redemption in their hearts. They knew now that true wisdom came not from the pursuit of power, but from the humble understanding of their place in the world. And so, the elders would say, as the sun set over the village, "When one seeks power without wisdom, they bring ruin upon themselves and those they love. The drum's beat calls to the soul, but only the humble heart can understand its rhythm. Respect for the ancestors is not a burden, but a bridge to wisdom." The story of Kofi lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a reminder to all who would listen of the price of arrogance and the power of humility. Kofi knelt before the sacred drums, his heart heavy with the weight of the world. The earth beneath him seemed to tremble, as though it, too, felt the pain of his heart. His body was worn, his spirit broken by the weight of his pride and the curse that had befallen his village. There was no going back now. He had seen the devastation, the withered crops, the dry riverbeds, the animals that fled in fear, and the once thriving village now reduced to shadows of its former self. In his hands, he held the mallets that once brought him glory, but now they felt like stones, too heavy to lift. The drums, the sacred drums that he had once used to command power, now seemed to call him to humility. Kofi's eyes were fixed on them, as though seeking forgiveness in their ancient wood, their hollow depths that had echoed with the voices of ancestors long past. "I offer my life," Kofi said, his voice barely a whisper, "for the sins I have committed. Take me, take everything, but restore balance to our land. I beg of you, ancestors, let the curse be lifted." The drums, silent for so long, seemed to stir at his words. At first, it was just a soft vibration beneath his fingers, as though they too were moved by his plea. Then, slowly, the beat began, but this time it was different. It was no longer a commanding rhythm, a call for power or dominance. The sound was softer, gentler, like the heart of the earth speaking to him with kindness. Kofi's hands trembled as he played, not out of fear, but from the weight of his repentance. The sound of the drums filled the air, but this time it was not ominous. It was a song of healing, a rhythm of surrender. He had come to realize that true healing could not be found in the pursuit of power, but in acknowledging one's faults and being willing to make amends. As the rhythm of the drums swirled around him, A calmness washed over the land. The storm, clouds that had threatened the village for so long, began to part, and the winds that had howled in anger now whispered softly, like the sighs of the earth itself. The earth beneath Kofi's knees seemed to exhale, as though it had forgiven him. The balance that had been broken was slowly being restored, one beat at a time. But even as the land began to heal, Kofi knew that the curse could never be completely undone. The scars of his actions would remain forever, like the cracks in the earth that could not be fully sealed. The fate of the village had been sealed by the choices he had made, and no amount of repentance could erase the consequences of defying the ancestors. The damage was done, and even as the village began to flourish once more, the scars of the past would never fade. The villagers, who had gathered silently in the distance, watched as the once dominant figure of Kofi, now humbled, offered his life in a final act of atonement. They had witnessed the storm of destruction that had followed his ambition, and now they saw the storm of redemption that followed his humility. They understood now, in a way they had never before, the importance of respecting the natural order, the authority of the elders, and the wisdom of the ancestors. The young ones, whose lives had been shaped by the curse, now stood with wide eyes, their hearts filled with a new understanding. They knew that the balance between humanity and the divine was fragile, that fate, once disturbed, could never be easily corrected. But they also knew that true progress could only be achieved through respect for the past and humility before the wisdom of the elders. As Kofi grew older, his body scarred but his soul at peace, he became the teacher he had once resisted. He spoke to the young ones, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his years. Ambition without wisdom is like the storm that destroys everything in its path. But when we learn to respect the wisdom of the past, when we learn to honor the ancestors, we build a foundation that can withstand even the fiercest winds. The villagers, now flourishing once more, gathered around him, eager to learn from his story. Kofi's tale became a warning, a reminder of the dangers of disregarding tradition in the pursuit of progress. He taught them that true progress did not come from abandoning the old ways, but from understanding and integrating them into the present. "Look at the earth," Kofi would say, his gaze sweeping over the village. "It heals, yes, but it does not forget. The scars are still there, and they will remain. We must live with them, but we must also learn from them. Respect the ancestors, and the land will provide. Disrespect them, and the land will take away." The younger generation listened intently, their hearts filled with the lessons of the past. They vowed to honor the balance between old and new, to never repeat the mistakes of the past. And as the years passed, the village flourished, not just in the crops that grew, but in the wisdom that had been passed down through the generations. And so, the story of Kofi became a legend, told by the elders to the young ones, a tale of ambition, downfall, and redemption. The village would never forget the lesson, that fate, when disturbed, brings inevitable consequences, but that humility, respect, and wisdom can restore balance to the world. And in that balance, true healing could be found.